A motion to hold a public inquiry into alleged political interference in the SNC-Lavalin criminal case has been rejected. The Liberal majority defeated it in a 134 to 160 vote. There was one abstention, though, and it's a significant one because it was Jody Wilson-Raybould herself, possibly the most important witness in this case and a witness who has yet to tell her story. CBC's Chris Hall is here, national affairs editor and host of the CBC Radio's The House. It's a mouthful. Sorry, Chris.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So, okay, let's start with that clip that we just played, what Jody Wilson-Raybould said when she got up to abstain from that vote. How significant do you think it is?
Really significant. Two things that she said there. First of all, it's not her decision or her ability to waive solicitor-client privilege. That rests with the Prime Minister. I think almost anyone who watched that took away from it that she wants to tell her story, speak my truth, she said, and that she is putting the ball firmly in the Prime Minister's court. It's up to you now to put this forward. And the other thing is the truth. You know, what is her side of the story? She hasn't said because of solicitor-client privilege. I think we saw when Jerry Butts resigned on Monday, when he talked about allegations and being able to defend himself and his reputation, that he expects Jody Wilson-Raybould will at some point speak. We don't know if she's going to confirm that she was indeed pressured by someone in the Prime Minister's office, whether it was Jerry Butts or anyone else. We also know that she has been very cagey about what she said today to caucus, talking to a number of members. I just got off doing an interview with Francis Scarpaleggi, and it was like chasing a scald cat to try and get him to talk about what precisely the mood was afterwards, other than to say he believes the caucus is united, but that big question still hangs over them. What is she going to say? When will she say it? And to what extent does that add to the problems that Liberals already face as they head into a crucial election year? Even
the reaction in that clip, you could kind of hear a few gasps in the room.
And some applause, but it wasn't from the government's benches. That came entirely from the Conservatives and New Democrats. Liberals, with I think a handful of exceptions, said nothing to it, and they were the ones doing the gasping. Look, she did appear in caucus today. That was something that she had promised to do. Our understanding is that it was a relatively painless exercise. There are some people who still feel quite strongly that there was a role for her to play to try and shoot this whole thing down. Also concerns about maybe how the Prime Minister has handled it, with the story changing sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly over the last 2 weeks since the Globe and Mail first reported these allegations by unnamed sources about unnamed people inside the Prime Minister's office. Clearly, it's a political issue, Vashi. Clearly, they are struggling to put it behind them, and clearly a lot of the success or failure at that will depend, again, on what Jody Wilson-Raybould has to say.
And when she did have something to say, it was to Cabinet yesterday. She made that surprise. We were sitting right here when we saw her walk into that room, kind of.
There were some gasps in this room then,
yeah,
too.
there were some gasps in this room. You have been doing a bit of digging into what was said in that meeting and how it all came about, and what have you learned?
Yeah, two things really interesting. She asked for that meeting on Tuesday morning, just before Cabinet. She asked the Prime Minister directly. He took it to Cabinet, and they spent better than 2 hours debating whether she should be given the opportunity, in large part because this is the inside circle, the most senior people within the government, a group that she had quit a week earlier. So not only is that unprecedented, but having somebody come in and talk about their side of the story to Cabinet, who's no longer a member and has resigned because of some dispute over what has been transpiring, led a lot of people to say, well, wait a minute, should we be hearing from her? What will she tell us? Does this send the right optics? Does this portray a government that's in charge, or is actually getting more behind-the-scenes, non-transparent information from a key figure? In the end, the Prime Minister decided that she should be allowed in. She spoke for about an hour. I think that from what we understand, one of the people leading the charge to have her speak was the Labour Minister, Patty Hajdu. We don't know precisely what Jody Wilson-Raybould said. We do know that she was unapologetic about the fact that she has not spoken, and the fact that this thing continues to fight is not her fault. But in the end, again, we have to wait and see what she's going to be allowed to say. We know she has her own counsel. We know the Prime Minister has David Lametti, her successor as Attorney General, both being asked for advice on what can be said publicly to ensure that ongoing criminal prosecutions against SNC-Lavalin aren't compromised. But in the end, I go back to my original point. She clearly believes now, despite whatever advice she may get from Thomas Cromwell, her lawyer, that the ball is now in the Prime Minister.
And you mentioned David Lametti, and that is who the Prime Minister says he's consulting with to determine whether or not to waive that privilege. He will also appear before the Justice Committee tomorrow. How do you expect that?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one because I know he was on the list. I'm not up to date with the actual appearances, but yes, look, he's the guy who's going to set sort of the framework for around which the government can speak and what advice he's considering, what the legal ramifications might be. Look, this committee hearing is a really interesting dynamic. We know the Liberals blocked efforts by both the NDP and the Conservatives to add other people to the witness list. We know they relented yesterday to allow Jody Wilson-Raybould to speak, who says she will appear, but with the caveat that I can only say what I'm allowed to under solicitor-client privilege, and that's not probably going to be the answers they want. Jerry Butts, the opposition wants him to speak, still not on the witness list, although, again, Francis Scarpaleggia is suggesting today that the committee's free to add more names if they so desire, and the Liberals, of course, have the majority, so we'll see. But right now, it's basically an exercise about what is the client privilege, solicitor-client privilege, what is the traditional role of the Attorney General in these kinds of cases and talking to members of Cabinet about ongoing or expected prosecutions. The fine line, it's called the Shawcroft principle, the fine line is you cannot advise the Attorney General to take any specific action, and that's where we are still kind of trying to find answers. We know the Prime Minister met on September the 17th with Jody Wilson-Raybould. That was roughly 2 weeks after the prosecution decided they would not accept this plea bargain arrangement for SNC-Lavalin to allow them to pay a fine rather than go to court. We don't know what was said there. The Prime Minister did not answer those questions today. He did not answer the question whether he would appear before the committee himself if called. So there are lots of questions that still remain unanswered.
Tons and tons of questions. Thank you, Chris. The CBC's Chris Hall. As we just heard, Jody Wilson-Raybould says she wants to tell her side of the SNC-Lavalin story, but her ability to do so is not in her hands. The former Justice Minister and Attorney General spoke in the House of Commons today, explaining why she was abstaining on a vote of an NDP motion to hold a public inquiry into the matter. Let's take a listen again.
And I do not think that it is appropriate for me to vote on a matter that has to do with me personally. I have said that I am seeking counsel on this matter of what I can and cannot say. I understand fully that Canadians want to know the truth and want transparency. Privilege and confidentiality are not mine to waive, and I hope that I have the opportunity to speak my truth.
See, now that Jody Wilson-Raybould has said explicitly she wants to speak her truth, will the government waive privilege? And what else is the opposition planning to do to get answers on this case? Marco Mendicino is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure. He joins us along with Michael Cooper. He's the Conservative Justice critic, and Charlie Angus is the NDP's Ethics critic. Hi to all three of you. Thank you so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it. Mr. Mendicino, I'll start with you. As we said, Ms. Wilson-Raybould said today that she wants to speak her truth. She also said that privilege and confidentiality are not mine to waive. Do you agree?
Well, I'm not going to speak on behalf of Ms. Wilson-Raybould. I think her statements, both in the House and previously, speak for themselves. What I will do is reiterate what the Prime Minister has said on this issue, which is that he is seeking legal advice from the current Attorney General, David Lametti, and obviously will take decisions consistent with that.
But I'm not asking you to speak for her. I'm just asking you if you agree that that privilege has to be waived by the Prime Minister, that the ability for her to speak, as she's laid out today, is not for her to decide.
Look, at the end of the day, Ms. Wilson-Raybould will take positions that represent her and her interests, and as the Prime Minister has said, as it relates to this matter, he is, in the proper course, going to seek legal advice from the Attorney General of Canada, and that's David Lametti. And obviously, privilege, as I said yesterday in open debate, is an important legal tradition. It is essential to the proper functioning of government. The Supreme Court of Canada has held is that if we easily or flippantly erode that principle, which is constitutional, it could actually undermine the administration of justice. And this is a government that respects the administration of justice. It respects the independence of the judiciary. And we both need to take that into consideration, as well as all of the other business which this government is pursuing.
Mr. Cooper, Mr. Lametti, or Minister Lametti, I should say, I'm sorry, will appear at committee tomorrow. Are you concerned at all about the issue of privilege and how it might affect his ability to speak candidly?
Well, look, this all rests on the Prime Minister. If he has nothing to hide, then he should simply lift solicitor-client privilege. The reason he doesn't want to do that, it appears, is because he has a lot to hide. And we found out every day this story drags on, the worse it gets for the Prime Minister. Of course, today's revelation was that, in fact, the Prime Minister met with Jody Wilson-Raybould after the Director of Public Prosecutions made the determination not to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin. That's contrary to the Prime Minister's assertion that the decision was hers to make. If in fact it was Minister Wilson-Raybould's decision to make, then what was the Prime Minister meeting with Minister Wilson-Raybould about this matter after the decision had already been made, other than to interfere with or put pressure on the minister to interfere with the independence of the public prosecutor? It raises serious concerns, and the Prime Minister needs to come clean and answer for that.
Yeah, and I do want to ask about that timeline in a second, but on the issue of privilege, are you sympathetic to the government's position that with two cases before, criminal cases involving SNC-Lavalin before the courts, it's not something very simple to figure out?
Well, I'm not sympathetic to the government's position, and I'm not sympathetic to the position that Liberal MPs on the Justice Committee have taken, which is to say we'll hear from former Attorney General Wilson-Raybould while she has one arm tied behind her back, while we're not going to hear from anyone in the PMO. At the end of the day, she may not be able to tell us very much, and that's just unacceptable. But it's consistent with what I've been saying, which is that the Liberal members on the Justice Committee are agents of the PMO who are doing the work of the PMO to cover up the Prime Minister's misconduct or potential misconduct.
Mr. Angus, what do you think about the necessity of taking some time to figure out privilege and waiving it?
I think what we're seeing here is a ridiculous sideshow for the Liberals, who are suddenly concerned about the administration of justice. The fundamental question is whether the Prime Minister's office interfered with the administration of justice, and that they have attempted to monkey wrench one of the largest corruption investigations in history, and what did the Prime Minister tell the Justice Minister, and why was she removed? What Ms. Wilson-Raybould did today is unprecedented, something I've never seen in my 15 years, to stand up in the House and say she is unable to vote on a motion that would call for an independent investigation of the Prime Minister because she is being held back by her client. The client is the Prime Minister, that she says she wants to be able to speak her truth. This is a woman who I think is showing incredible integrity. And then a minute later, the client was able to stand up and vote down a motion into whether or not he and his staff interfered with that legal investigation. The Prime Minister is looking very bad on this. The stories change every single day. And to hide behind the solicitor-client privilege is what they're actually hiding behind, is protecting the Prime Minister, protecting Gerald Butts, protecting the PMO from saying what was the pressure put on the Justice Department in order to attempt to monkey wrench that investigation.
Mr. Mendocino, why hasn't the government, or why wasn't the government completely clear and completely explicit that the meeting that occurred between the Prime Minister and Jody Wilson-Raybould occurred after SNC was informed of the decision not to go ahead with the DPA?
Well, I'm going to come to that, but first I need to correct a few inaccuracies that Charlie just mentioned in his response to your question, Vashi. The first is that the Prime Minister is not the client. The government of Canada is the client. I'm sorry, Charlie.
Is the Prime Minister not making that decision?
The Prime Minister is the client.
Let's let Mr. Mendocino finish.
Down the rabbit hole.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
Down the rabbit hole.
No one individual has right to this privilege. It is a government privilege. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's been some attempt to try and throw a monkey wrench, to use his word, into the investigation of these allegations. The opposition have been an allegation. Thus far, all of those allegations are on the basis of anonymous sources. Anonymous sources and supposition.
Marco.
I'm sorry if I
Bye-bye, Jerry.
Let's let Mr. Mendocino finish, and I promise I'll let you both back in.
Thank you. Now, there are two processes which are in play. I would point out, when it comes to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, both of my colleagues to the left said that we would never convene a hearing. A hearing was called.
That.
Yes.
I never said that.
No, there were statements made by your colleagues from the Conservative Party who said that there's never going to be a committee hearing. There's now one had.
Useless here.
Then we convened, and then they said that there would not be an effort to try and get witnesses to testify before the committee. Minister Wilson-Raybould has now been invited to the committee.
Yeah, after they said they didn't want to hear.
Every time there has been progress on the committee, there has been some additional allegation, again totally baseless, with regards to the independence of that process.
Okay, let me.
So I think we need to let these processes unfold. In addition,
I just want to follow up on the point you were making about client. Are you saying that it's not the Prime Minister's decision to waive that privilege?
I'm saying there is no one individual who claims the government of Canada's privilege in this particular case. That's a decision that will be taken by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Governor Council, which is his cabinet. Okay, and you didn't answer the question about why the government was not forthcoming about when the Prime Minister met with Jody Wilson-Raybould. Why did they not explicitly tell Canadians, or why did your government not explicitly tell Canadians that that meeting occurred after the decision was made not to proceed with a DPA? Look, Vashti, the facts and the evidence and the timelines will all come out in the two processes which I have mentioned to you. I think that
So you can't answer that today.
instead of rushing to conjecture, which is what the opposition are trying to do, I'm sorry, but there has been much conjecture, much hypothesizing in the absence of facts and evidence. And yes, of course, Ms. Wilson-Raybould will be coming to the Justice Committee to testify. In addition to that, there is also the Ethics Commissioner, who is independent, nonpartisan, who is in the throes of that. Let's let these two processes unfold.
Okay, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Angus both want to weigh in, I can tell, so I'll start with Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, again, if the Prime Minister met with Jody Wilson-Raybould after the decision had already been made, as we now know, which the Prime Minister was not forthcoming about, then what was he talking to her about other than to put some level of pressure or to encourage her to interfere in an independent criminal prosecution? That is an extremely serious issue, and it's the strongest piece of evidence that the Prime Minister himself may have either acted inappropriately or perhaps illegally in this matter. And with respect to this sideshow of the Justice Committee, which is really unfortunate that it's become that, the Liberal members doing the work at the PMO have called former Attorney General Wilson-Raybould, but again, subject to solicitor-client privilege. Meanwhile, we can't hear from Gerald Butts. Fact, he met with Jody Wilson-Raybould specifically on SNC-Lavalin just before she was fired as Attorney General. Fact, he made a blanket denial. He removed her from the role of Attorney General, and it's also a fact that Mr. Butts has made a blanket denial. Put him under oath. Let him be tested. Let him answer questions before the Canadian people. Again, if this government has nothing to hide, what is the Prime Minister afraid of?
Okay, Mr. Angus, final word to you.
Well, the issue here, and let's stay focused on the fact that we have numerous meetings with SNC and top government officials in the PMO. Fact that the law of Canada was rewritten to provide this free get-out-of-jail card and was slipped into an omnibus bill. And then fact that after the independent prosecution service decided, no, sorry, SNC is not going to be able to get that card, that calls were made and a meeting was held with the minister, and then she left under some manner of cloud. And then Jerry Butts, who seems to be swirling all around this, suddenly has to jump ship. And yet the Liberals tell us, don't worry, we'll all get to the bottom of it, as long as she has to go to committee and be kept under solicitor-client privilege, and as long as nobody in the Prime Minister's office is forced to testify. That does not pass the smell test. Canadians want answers, and I think this has been extremely corrosive on Justin Trudeau's credibility, on a man who told Canadians he was going to do politics differently. Right now, it's been a different story every day. They're in damage control. I think the loss of Mr. Butts is severely damaging to the Prime Minister. So I'm just saying to the Prime Minister, come clean. Let the PMO staff testify openly, and then we'll know if there's something to be concerned about, or then we'll know that everything was fine. But until then, this is the cloud that hangs over the Prime Minister.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm sorry, I'm out of time.
Open process with the committee. It's independent, and
we
allow
will
that process to unfold.
And we, along with Canadians, will be watching that committee tomorrow morning. Thank you so much to all three of you. Thank you to Marco Mendicino, Michael Cooper, and Charlie Angus.